now I'll introduce our guest speaker, Michael Austin, and he's a Kansas economist, and he's going to talk on taxes and budget. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much to Rosemary and the Granny Brigade. And you guys really call yourselves the Granny Brigade? I always thought that was such a fascinating name.
We got that name from the radio station when we first started. We was calling in, telling them what we were doing, so they called us the Granny Brigade.
Well, hot dog. I guess if it sticks, you know, don't get rid of it. Well, I appreciate really being here tonight. As stated before, my name is Michael Austin. I am an economist by trade, and what that largely means is, well, I'll just use an example my wife likes to talk about. So there'll be times where I'll go out to events with my wife, and it'll be my wife's event. Maybe it's at her work, maybe it's with her friends, and she'll introduce me to her colleagues and her friends, and she'll go, "This is my husband, Michael. He's an economist." And that just means he takes a very, 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 very long time to explain to you the obvious. So you gotta stop saying that. It works every time. But I am of the belief that wherever people have more freedom, prosperity increases. Doesn't matter whether you're in sub-Saharan Africa or in Latin America or here in Kansas, whenever people are free and that they can exercise their rights, right? 9 times out of 10, people's well-being soars, people have more income, rights are preserved, if not expanded, and overall society ends up being more prosperous and, you know, frankly, happier as well. And so I've kind of spent my life over the last, well, 10 plus years trying to promote more freedom-oriented policy in Kansas. I started off as an intern under Governor Sam Brownback. This was back in 2011 when he got hired. Apparently they liked me, and so they kept me around and put me at the Department of Revenue and Department of Labor, where I served as an analyst. And worked my way up, providing really good, helpful analysis on what was called the HOPE Act, which was trying to tie welfare benefits to means tested and work, making sure that those who receive any type of state assistance, of course, go find a job so that they don't have to stay on assistance, they don't have to stay on a sort of dependency. After that, I actually left. I went to DC for a little bit. I was awarded an Emerging Poverty Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. It's a national think tank. Thanks to my work in helping promote more freedom and means testing when it came to welfare programs. I came back to Kansas probably back in 2016, 2017, and Governor Brownback at the time made me chief economist, so I was his economic advisor, housed at the Kansas Department of Revenue. And one of my, most proud achievements is back in 2017, December 2017, and roughly more than 5 years ago, President Trump passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Now, of course, that had massive implications and ripple effects throughout the entire country. But as chief economist for the state of Kansas, housed in the Department of Revenue, it was my job to figure out how that federal law interacted with state law. And I remember this vividly because I thought I was going to have Christmas vacation. But lo and behold, I did not. This was December 22nd of 2017, and that law passed. I had to come back into the office because the state legislature wanted to know all the intricacies of that federal law and how it interacted with any state law. And I had found in my research that obviously most Kansans got the lion's share of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It was around $2,200, around $2,000 to $2,200. But there was a sizable amount of money that did not go to you. In fact, it went to the state. Due to state law, I had estimated about a little over $100 million every year was actually going to state coffers because of the way that the Kansas state law interacted with federal law. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, the following year, I presented those findings to the legislature and made the suggestion that they need to decouple from certain federal laws that allowed Kansans to choose to itemize. So as an example, when you file your tax return, you can choose to take the itemized deductions or the standard. You may not have known this, but back in 2018, if you picked the standard on the federal, you had to pick the standard on the Kansas one. You could not mix and match, so to speak. So I advocated for separating that, allowing you to do whatever you want on the Kansas return, no matter what you did on the federal, because I had estimated that that would allow you to capitalize on almost all the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. The legislature agreed. They put together a bill, and they tried to pass it through. They got through both chambers, but it wasn't enacted. Can anyone guess as to why? Two words, right? It's Shmora Schmelly. Laura Kelly, the governor, vetoed the bill. In fact, that was 2018. She had vetoed, the legislature brought that bill back every year since 2018, and every year she vetoed it. And in fact, Representative Howe, hopefully you can correct me, but I believe the legislature finally had the votes to override her veto. Oh, it was very recent. I would like to think it's maybe 2021 or 2022. It took that long to finally get enough votes to override her. So that was called the Kansas Itemization Act, but it was my brainchild for trying to find ways that we can give you as much of the resources from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act back to you. Since then, I've been doing a number of things. I am a member of what's called Project 21, which is a national network of African American conservatives speaking about national issues. Obviously, my bread and butter is about economics, so I talk about those issues. I was also a coalition partner to, what was that project again that the left got really upset about in the last election? They call Project 2025. Yes, I was a coalition member for Project 2025. I sat on the board for the Department of Education, which we advocated removing it, for the U.S. Department of Treasury, which we advocated for decreasing the IRS, and of course providing more income tax relief. And then I was also on the Federal Reserve, and that one in particular was making more members of the Federal Reserve appointed, as opposed to appointed by the president, as opposed to their nominating commission. So that was a great experience. Now I work as a legislative and coalitions director for Americans for Prosperity. That is the operation that you might know out in Wichita. What happens to that organization? Wrong, it gets more money. Either nothing happens, or maybe someone somewhere along the line says the only reason that this organization was failing was because we didn't give enough resources. Or maybe it's left to stand and another organization is created to do what the original one is supposed to do. I give you that analogy not to say that private initiatives and ideas are inherently better than government ideas. That is not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that in the private sector, you have survive and adapt, right? Either they provide a product, if it's not working, customers leave, they have to adapt, otherwise they're going to die. Survival of the fittest. But in the public organization, we have an expansion of mistakes. And we have an expansion of mistakes because inherent in government, there is no mechanism for recognizing whether an idea is a good one or a bad one. Government can have good ideas. Government can have bad ideas. The private sector can have good ideas. The private sector can have bad ideas. The difference, though, is that the private sector has an incentive to find the difference between the two. Whereas government, we pay taxes whether we're getting a good service or not. Or when we elect people to take different roles within government, they may fix those issues or they may not. It may have nothing to do with why they were elected. And so the issue with government is that it has no mechanism for recognizing error. Is that something that we can change within Kansas government? And I believe there is a way to do that. It is called performance-based budgeting. What that effectively means is that you take every dollar, every taxpayer dollar spent, and you assign a goal to it. What is the purpose of spending this dollar? What is the benefit we want to put out there in Kansas? If there's a homeless program out there, for every dollar it spends, What's the goal? Is the goal to reduce the homeless population? Is that dollar being spent matching that goal to reduce the homeless population in the area? Or is it not? If the dollar that's being spent here is for attorney fees, is that attorney doing something that is beneficial to the organization? Can we track that? By tying every public benefit to the taxpayer dollar spent, not only do we know where the dollars go, but over time we can track it to see whether that trend or that goal is being met or not. This law was passed already in 2016. Governor Collier at the time did not really have much time to implement it, and then Laura Kelly has been flat out ignoring it. But in that law, we finally got state agencies, thanks to the legislature, to start marking down where every taxpayer dollar goes, what goals do they want to be measured by, and how have those goals, or and have they been meeting those goals over time? That law has been followed. In 2023, I decided to look at that performance-based budget report for all state agencies that applied for it. And I apologize for this, I'm gonna speak a bit from memory here. What I decided to do was say, let's define what waste means. Or at the very least, let's define what unsupervised spending means. I'm gonna say that waste means this. Waste means that you are not meeting your goal. Like as an example, if my goal was to move towards the American flag here, and I was moving in the opposite direction, I would count that as a problem, right? So I would say, are you moving away from the goal that you're supposed to get to? And then number two, are you seeing more taxpayer funds allocated to you? In other words, are you seeing an increase in taxpayer funds? Are you spending more money every year, but moving farther and farther away from your goal? So a very, really strict definition I made. That's going to mean waste. I'm going to count all the state agencies that are moving farther away from their goal and are receiving more money. Do you know how much money I found?
A lot.
800 million. The state budget is about, well, at that time, probably about 8 or 9 billion. All funds between 15 and 20. And so I found around 800 million of unsupervised spending. So that would be spending going to state agencies that were moving farther away from their goal and got an increase in funds over time. Out of that 800 million, there are about 65 state agencies that didn't even report what their goals were. So let alone whether they've gotten more money or not, they did get taxpayer funding, but they couldn't even follow the law and report what their goals were. So all the more reason why it's so important that, yes, the legislature take more and more effort to enforce the law on the books and hold Laura Kelly accountable. But at the same time, it also goes to show why it's so important to get the right governor in place as well. Because we could have so much more relief, so much more tax relief, and maintain quality government services as long as we just enforce the law that's on the books. You know, it's funny enough, you don't need to pass a new law, all you need is a new governor, right? President Trump. It just goes to show the solutions are inherent in the system, and you just need to find the people that will promote that. And so 2 years ago, I looked at performance-based budgeting, and I found roughly $800 million of unsupervised spending. I did it again this year. Nearly $3 billion of unsupervised spending. Now, that doesn't mean all of that is waste. It just means roughly $3 billion are going to state agencies that are moving farther away from the goals that they picked out for themselves. And they're getting more allocation over time. Right? Because the thought process behind this, if you have this properly implemented, not only do you have ways of making sure that you can bring relief back to folks, but you can also find those programs that are doing a good job and you can reward them. Right? Hey, I'm taking money from program A. Why are you taking money away from program A? That's not fair. Well, I'd rather fund program B. Program B is working. They're meeting their goals. And they're doing it with either the same allocation or even with less money given to them. Let's reward that. I'd rather have that money go back to you. Or I'm going to take money away from Program C because Program C has been around for 5-10 years and they're moving far, and they're worse now than they were 5 years ago. And they've had more money. It's time that we do something different. And so the beauty about this type of program is that whether you're a Democrat or whether you're a Republican, if you like, certain government programs and you want to see them succeed, right, then you can find a way to do that. That doesn't mean you have to cut. If you're looking for, if you're a conservative and you're looking for agencies to cut, well, look for those that are moving farther away from their goals and are seeing more money. That could be a possible avenue for you to look for. And all you really need is the messaging and the spine, right, to really go out there and advocate on behalf of the taxpayer. So I've rattled on quite a bit here. I'm going to talk about maybe a couple more things. This was definitely on the budget side. Let me move over to taxes for a little bit. On taxes, one of the things that we're really proud of was working with the Speaker of the House, Dan Hawkins, Senate President Ty Masterson, on simplifying our income tax rates. So 2 years ago, Kansas had 3 income tax brackets. The highest one was 5.7%. The middle one was 2.5, and the lowest one was around 3%, let's say 3.1. What we wanted to do was say, can we condense that into one single rate? We understand the politics. The politics may not want to go back to zero income taxes, though I believe we should go to zero income taxes. But what about making taxes easier to understand, right? By reducing it down to one rate, everybody pays the same rate, and that means it's the same share no matter whether you make a lot of money or you make a little money, everybody's paying the same share. Not only that, but we also wanted to put a massive exemption underneath those brackets for low-income folks. So translation, that meant we wanted to push a policy that said for those who are working minimum wage or less, you don't owe any state income taxes. For everybody else, you got a pay raise, right? That was the policy that we were trying to push. Through just the politics of working through the legislative session, we had to compromise on doing 2 rates. So we went from 3 down to 2. And we still got that massive exemption for low-income folks. This year, we're trying to finish what we started by using excess revenues to condense it into one single rate. So I talked to you about how we could use surplus revenues to provide income tax relief. Well, this bill in particular wants to use those surplus revenues to condense down to one single rate. And I hope that that most certainly passes. Sales tax. Sales tax, my personal belief on sales tax is I think we have a lot of exemptions. If you don't know what an exemption is, think about it as let's say a bucket holding water, right? That bucket will hold a certain amount of water. If you poke a hole in that bucket, water drains out. If you poke a lot of holes in that bucket, a lot of water drains out. That's effectively how our sales tax policy works and how exemptions work. The sales tax is the bucket, the exemptions are the holes in the bucket, right? And I find that those exemptions are particularly problematic. Now, I think certain exemptions are great. If it's a business-to-business exemption, you should probably keep that. You don't want to pyramid tax increases. But if it's not business-to-business, you shouldn't have it. And here's why. Anybody ever played Jenga?
Yeah.
Okay, well, so if you have grandkids, I got little ones, we love playing Jenga. How do you play Jenga? You got a tower, right? And the goal is to take a block out of that tower. Well, that tower effectively is what we call your sales tax base. Right? That's the volume of all things that you could apply sales tax to. You take a block out of there, that's like putting an exemption in, right? You're putting a hole in that tower. Now what happens to that base? It gets a little wobbly, doesn't it? And what do you do with that extra block? You put it on top. The way you play Jenga, you keep taking blocks out, you keep putting it on top. Eventually that tower gets higher and higher, and then eventually how does the game end? It topples over and completely collapses. That's what sales tax exemption does to our sales tax base. Every time you put in an exemption, if you want to keep the same amount of revenue coming in, you have to do what? You have to raise the tax rate, right? And so you raise the tax rate higher, right? But then you have more holes. The more holes you have in that tax base, the higher you have to raise that sales tax rate to get the same amount of revenue. And eventually it's going to collapse. So my thought process is, get rid of almost all of the exemptions, and then what are you able to do? Lower the rate. This was a couple of years ago. But I had found that if you had gotten rid of all the exemptions, save for the business-to-business ones and the ones that are in our Kansas Constitution, you could probably lower the state sales tax rates around 2%. Right? It's currently 6.5. So you can lower it to 2%, and that could obviously, and that's not just food, right? That could be clothes, that could be cars, that could be whatever type of electronics, whatever it is, right? Whatever those sales taxes apply for, imagine paying a 2% state sales tax rate on it. So that's our focus on sales tax rate. Can we stop, can we fight and push back against those exemptions and advocate for lowering the rate and broadening that base? When it comes to property taxes, that's a tough one. And it's a tough one, not because of the tax itself. It's a tough one because according to our Kansas Constitution, it's not really a state tax, right? The burden, the lion's share of property tax is not at the state level. Where is it? It's at the local level, right? That's at your county, it's at your city, it's at your school board, it's at your library, it's at your water district, it's at your whatever. So the issue with solving property taxes is problematic because if you really want to be effective in lowering rates lowering relief from the state level, you have to interfere at the local level. And that'll take a constitutional change. So as an example, there was a bill early on in the legislature, I no longer remember the number, but it wanted to increase the exemption, increase the exemption of your home from property taxes. It was at $42,000, so roughly $42,000 of your home was not subject to state property tax. They wanted to increase it to $75,000, and then this year they wanted to increase it to $100,000. All well and good. We were talking about maybe a $50 property tax cut, right? And I live in Douglas County, which means I apparently love pain and torture. But my property taxes are in the thousands. Approaching $10,000 a year, right? And so $50, yes, I guess it's better than nothing, but I don't really feel that. And that's partly why, and the Kansas legislature acknowledges that as well. And that's probably why we're seeing these constitutional amendments being proposed by the Senate, one proposed by the House, to do what they can to try to limit the growth of your property tax hikes. Now, keep note with what I said. These amendments that they're proposing at the House and the Senate want to limit property tax hikes. I didn't say property tax relief, right? The goal here, at least with the bills or the amendments that are being proposed, is to limit how high your property taxes will rise. But it's not necessarily property tax relief. So I know you probably have questions on that, but on the Senate side, there's a bill that would cap your appraisals at 3%, right? And I believe it's even retroactive. I can't remember what year it went back to, but I think that retroactivity could actually result in some tax relief. But it's going to cap your appraisals at 3%. The House version has its own cap, and the cap, I believe, follows the rolling average for farm values, which is, oh goodness, anyone. What's the rolling average? Is it 6 years?
It's 8 for farm, but the one in the proposal is 6 for residential.
Okay, so I am right in saying 6. So it's a 6-year rolling average. So instead of it being 3%, they look at the growth over the last 6 years and they cap your appraisals at that. Why are they different? It actually is an economic issue, actually. The Senate version capping it at 3%, while it does a hard cap of 3% for everybody, it does create some sort of what we call an externality. In particular, if it encourages more people to stay in their home because their property value is lower, then that means less housing churn. And if you don't have as much housing churn, you don't really see lower housing prices. So you have people who stay in their home, which might be great, but it also keeps new homeowners from coming in. Because if they come into the housing market, they'll have to pay exorbitantly high property taxes. So the House tried to solve that by softening that cap, and I think that it's a better alternative, but at the same time, now you would be experiencing a higher tax increase than the Senate version. And so there's a debate among lawmakers, which version should be the law of the land. I'm not entirely sure where that's going to end up, actually. But it's an interesting conversation to have. Ultimately, I think the best solution is being engaged at the local level. I think it's just naturally difficult for state lawmakers to tackle property taxes because then you weigh into all these other issues at the local level. Ideally, what does it mean? Ideally, you should be holding your city leaders, your county leaders, your school board accountable for either tax relief or not, and if they don't, we should vote them out. Is it hard to do? Yes, it's hard to do, right? But that would be the best way, and it's a way that it's a way that makes sure that your local budget best desires whatever the community wants, right? One thing I always talk about is whenever you have a single organization making decisions for everybody, you run into something what's called the knowledge problem. What does that mean? Well, let's take an example. Let's say, for example, I was buying you all dinner. I'm not, but let's say I was. And I decided I'm going to get one dish for everybody. What if I decided everybody's getting steak? Representative Howe would be completely happy, right? Because he was like, I was going to order steak for myself anyway, so this is perfect, right? But Mrs. Jungle wasn't going to have the steak, she was going to have a salad. And now she doesn't feel as happy, right? Because she would have gotten a salad for herself, but now I'm forcing her to eat a jungle, right? Because I'm not each and every one of you, I don't know what each and every one of your individual desires are. I have to make a one-size-fits-all. And that means some people are going to be happy, and some people are not. And that's the issue we have with property taxes. When the issue is at the local level, that means the solutions to that property taxes are in the local level. It's not going to be found in Topeka. And so we're going to keep having this issue with the state, with state government trying to fix property taxes, and it's going to keep making solutions that not everybody's going to be happy about. I didn't mean to get so dismal and depressing about that, but that's what economics is. It's the dismal science. So I think that there's great, tremendous opportunity for future growth, but instead of it being a debate about which tax to reduce, it needs to be about how do we responsibly lower spending so that we can maintain quality government services and frankly cut the fat. Because by doing that, we create the best opportunity for Kansans to prosper and grow, and you'll find that once Kansans can have a better economic well-being, it seems like all other issues just naturally fall to the wayside. So thank you so much for the time and the opportunity to speak to you.
This just has a point on here. I guess it's a question. Could you give us some information on homestead tax refund for veterans, the income range required, and when did that start?
Oh, no, I cannot, because I have to look that up. Oh, I'm sorry about that. No, that is not something that I know off the top of my head. But I do know that there are legislators out there that are trying to expand that. Effectively say that if you're a veteran, you serve your country. If you are a senior, obviously, who have spent an entire life working and providing and paying into the system, you should not be taxed out of your home. And I completely understand that. I think that there's a better alternative out there, which is finding a way that you can just eliminate state property taxes, period. But until we get there, right, I understand the logic of rewarding those who gave back and trying to find a way that people don't keep going to Florida and Texas.
This question says, Governor Kelly ran on cutting the grocery tax. Can you give an update on that? Okay,
she ran on it, but it wasn't her idea, right? I'll just put it at that. That actually came from lawmakers, and it was actually more of a battle. Laura Kelly was trying to lay claim to lowering grocery taxes. The House was, or not the House, the House and the Senate were trying to advocate it for her as well. And Laura Kelly actually, didn't she veto a tax relief provision that had lowering grocery sales tax in there? And I think it was because, actually, I think it might have had that that itemization that we talked about, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, trying to make sure you got most of that relief. At one particular year, lawmakers said, okay, well, let's include, giving Kansans 100% back of their Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Let's also include lowering sales tax rate on food and groceries, right? Let's also put some other things in here and just make one big package. She can't veto that, right? She vetoed it. So, but by and large, state sales tax on groceries was reduced. It was just reduced gradually. I believe last year, or actually no, this year, it has finally been eliminated, the state sales tax entirely. Last year was about 2%, now it's down to 0. Now, that does not mean you don't pay sales tax on groceries. It just means that the state sales tax rate on groceries is now 0. You still might have something at the local level. And then don't even get me started on what counts as food and what doesn't count as food. That gets very complicated.
What are your thoughts on a Doge for Kansas?
Okay, well, you already have the answer, right? We already have a Doge in Kansas, or at least we already have the structure in place so that we can implement a Doge. All we need is a new governor. A new governor, all we need, or maybe we need the legislature putting in some more teeth on that law, but everything is in place. State agencies already, for the most part, record the taxpayer dollars that are spent. And naturally, they're also supposed to be ranking it, right? If a state agency has 5 different programs that they're counting money going towards, they should be able to tell you which which program is the most important, right? And rank it to a certain extent, because when you have to right-size government, we want to start off with the services that are either not providing any benefit to the public at all or providing minimal benefit, right? We don't want to cut off the most valuable services out there, just like your heart versus your limbs or anything or your limbs or any of that sort. We want to make sure that government can still operate, and we want to cut the fat, not the heart.
This may be a follow-up question to that. Could you be our Elon Musk for Kansas?
I don't sell cars, though. I can't bring astronauts back from space stations. But I love what I do, and I don't want to go to D.C. I've already been to D.C. I know what that's like. It's a beautiful town. I really don't like the people. And I want to stay here. So, my wife and I, we have 3 children here in Kansas. We do want to leave Douglas County, but we want to stay in Kansas because we want to make this place our home. And so, as long as there's a politician, a lawmaker out there that wants to use my expertise, I'm more than willing to help. I already do that already. And I'll continue to be here, and I'll continue to provide value. And when I don't provide value, that probably means I'm bored.
This question says, how do states like Florida, etc., with no income tax generate revenue?
Okay. So, gosh. So yes, you have your Florida, doesn't have a state income tax. Texas doesn't have a state income tax. I always get this one confused. Oregon and Washington, I always forget. One of them doesn't have an income tax, the other doesn't have a sales tax. Washington doesn't have what?
Not sales tax, income tax.
Yeah, okay. Washington doesn't have an income tax, Oregon does not have a sales tax. Alaska doesn't have income or sales tax, I believe, right? And all of these governments can function. How is that? And the reason why goes back to how we started this conversation. It's not about the taxes. It's about the spending, right? Florida has found a way that they can maintain a certain level of spending without having to tax income. So has Texas, so has about 7 to 9 other states. Not only that, but now about, I'd say 50% of US states now either have no income tax or single rate. So that means now, it's so funny, 50% of US states have found a way to maintain a certain level of spending and to do it with either having no income tax or just one single rate on their income tax. So how do they do it? You've got to get the spending under control, Now, if you want to find something more revenue neutral, there are ways that you can do that. So as an example, Florida, right, has a pretty high taxes when it comes to a tourism-like industry. So going out to restaurants, bars, hotels, you come there to party or have a vacation, you'll pay high taxes on those types of things. But even then, Governor DeSantis, maybe about a week, 2 weeks ago, just announced an initiative. He wants to eliminate state property taxes, right? So now, at least in Florida, there's an initiative in place to not only not have an income tax, but also lower the state property taxes as well. So there are ways that you can do it, but it always goes back to the real burden of the tax, which is the spending. And so the question is, how do we do that? And whether we can find leaders in Kansas that are willing to do that, lead us into doing that. That would be great.
This question is regarding your performance-based budgeting and the grading of that, the judging of that. It says, how do you account for external variables when doing performance budgeting? The example given here is a farmer who sets goals and prices, but the crops are poor for a season. This is just an example of when it didn't work well.
Perfect. No, that makes perfect sense, because that clearly has to happen. No single organization can account for all factors that affect their ability to make their goals. And that's kind of what we have the appropriations process for. So every legislative session, we have state agencies that come up and say, you gave us X amount last year. We feel like we need X and an additional 5% this year, right? And lawmakers are supposed to ask questions and whatnot and probe to see whether that's really a proper allocation. So one thing I like about this performance-based budgeting is that it really helps lawmakers out. So if you have a state agency that says, hey, we didn't meet our goal, we need more money, I want a lawmaker to be able to pull up their performance-based budget report and say, okay, here you are. Well, actually, we gave you roughly 5% an increase in state spending every year for the last 3 years. Why were we not meeting the goal? And the beauty of that is now it creates a conversation. Lawmakers know what questions to ask, right? And through their back and forth and through the appropriations process, they can assess whether this is really needed or not. That is not happening now. That is not. Lawmakers are getting better at it, but we still need, I personally think we still need more guidance, and hopefully that can come from a governor, more guidance to prepare lawmakers to answer those types of questions. Because remember, lawmakers are only there for roughly 3 months. And they don't have the staff, right? So when these appropriations process comes up, it's really what they can do on their own to look at whoever's going to come in on that day and prepare questions. And frankly, they don't have the time or resources for it. But that's something that we can provide by doing this report on a regular basis and preparing lawmakers to answer those questions and hopefully find the right solution that works for them.
Sure. What is considered low income in Kansas?
Depends on who you ask. It depends on who you ask.
That's a great answer.
You have folks on the left that say low income, low income is $50,000 for a single Kansan. Like, that's median wage. It's like that's 50%. You have some on the right that says others. I don't like using those types of terms necessarily, only because it doesn't give you something that you can test. If I say poor or low income, everybody has a different idea about what that means in their mind. But if I say $30,000 for a single filer, $60,000 for a married filing joint, you guys know what I'm talking about. So that's really just political rhetoric. And sometimes it's used towards misleading ends, and sometimes it's completely genuine. But it goes to show that when you hear these types of terms, at least this is what I tell my students, you need to recognize, is this a statement that I can test, or is this a statement that speaks to what someone wishes would be? Wishes is out there in the world. Is it an opinion, or is it something that I can test right or wrong?
And we hear the term poverty level. Is that an economic term, or is that rhetoric like you're talking about?
It is an economic term. Poverty level speaks to how many families are living below a certain income threshold. And that income threshold is indexed to inflation. So as prices rise 5%, that income threshold rises 5%. But what's so funny, and I don't mean to get too much into the weeds, is that even among economists, we also kind of agree that, hey, just because the income threshold is set for $150,000 for a family of 4, doesn't necessarily mean that they're poor. So like as an example, would you rather be below the poverty level today or live below the poverty level 100 years ago? Today, right? If you live below the poverty level today, you at least got a fridge, most likely. You got a microwave, most likely. Maybe you even have air conditioning, right? Maybe you have a mattress, right? If you were low income 100 years ago, you wouldn't have such luxuries, right? So I say that to say that even though, yes, it is an objective standard that you can test, there are still even questions out there as to whether someone should really be considered low income or not, because if you think about the way that the economy grows, it's a rising tide that lifts all boats. You know, those who are considered low income by comparing it to their neighbor, right, is still way better off than where we were 10 years ago, 25 years ago, 50 years ago. And that's a conversation that economists are having amongst themselves. Politics, it doesn't really get into the politics discussion much.
This question is about SCR 1603, which apparently is the cap on values. Would this SCR 1603 be regressive, since declining or stable value areas would be valued at their market value, increasing value areas would be valued at less than their market value?
So regressive is another term that I'm not sure what people mean when they say it. So I'm going to skip it. And we'll go to the 3% valuation. I can't remember. I don't think that 3% valuation was applied across the board. I don't think it was applied to commercial and industrial property. Definitely residential. Can anyone fill me in?
Yes, it is.
It's applied to all property tax bases? Okay. Well, then if that's the case, then everybody's valuation is capped at 3%. Doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't necessarily mean that the taxes you pay is going to be capped at 3%. It just means the valuation. So as long as your mill levy adjusts to keep tax revenues the same, this is what we have with a currently called the revenue neutral rate, it would be capped at 3%. But that's not necessarily the case. The value that I see with the revenue neutral rate right now is that it's more of a transparency, right? You get a letter in the mail saying this is what your local government wants to do with your tax rate, and here's the hearing if you want to tell them whether you like it or not, and then they're going to vote for it. So that's the value I see with that, because that type of transparency in some places can already be a hindrance to raising tax rates further. Does it still create a type of inequality? No, I actually think it lessens it, but that has its own drawbacks as well, right? If your home value doesn't rise or reach market value until you sell it, then that means you are encouraged to stay in your home longer than you would have naturally needed to, right? In a perfect world, if we had low taxes and our home values rose, we would move. Hey, I now can get $300,000 if I sell my house. I'm going to move to someplace else and I'm going to capitalize on that. By capping that, maybe I don't leave. And then at the same time, those people who are buying into a house, they have to purchase a house at market rates, which means their property taxes will be at whatever that market rate is, which could be exorbitantly high. This is the issue with California, actually. It's the reason why you see people who say that they are low income and yet they live in an $800,000 house. And the reason why is because their property taxes are made low, but if they ever moved out, it would reset and they would have to pay the exorbitantly high property taxes. So it is it lessens the inequality, but it also creates other issues as well.
That was a very, 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 very long. No, I'm trying to steal your life joke there.
I warned you.
I'm sorry. I'll throw you an easy one here. Can you predict the price of eggs in 3 months?
Oh, that's my question. That's my question. I'll say this one. I'll say there's a reason why God created economists, and it's to make weather forecasters look good. I can't predict anything. I really can't.
With the subject of rental properties, is there currently a cap on a landlord increasing rent to a tenant?
No, there's not. I'll leave it at that.
I was joking, man. You can really have a longer answer. Last question here. Can you give an update on the state removing taxes on tips?
Oh. There was a press conference where I believe Senator Roger Marshall had pushed to introduce a bill to do that. I don't know if that's going anywhere. Have you heard about that? Yeah, I remember I saw it, but I don't remember any hearings on it or anything. That one's an iffy one because you have to kind of figure out how you do that. Unfortunately, I have my own bad personal experience. I worked at a restaurant, and when I got tips. Anyway, no, let me not say that. I don't want to get myself in trouble. But I'm just going to say it's just really hard to record tips. I'll just put that out there. It's really hard to record tips. So it'd be interesting on, I don't think a bill has come through even Congress on that either. So I'd be really interested in how you make that work. And even then, I would say, why focus on tips? Just focus on the whole income. Like, let's just, get rid of the income tax, which I think is kind of what President Trump is talking about right now. Like, now he's talking about, let's just find a way that we can eliminate income tax, period. And I think that's a far, far better policy to push than tips, which only affect, teenagers and people who are getting their first job in the service industry. Like, you're meant to move on and find either more rewarding work or a higher paying job. That shouldn't be our first focus. Let's do the heavy lifting first.
One of your points was the differential between private sector growth and governmental growth. Can you tell us where Kansas stands right now, or a trend that it's going?
Yes. So I looked into earlier. No, I think it was fall. Fall last year, I did an interview with media, and I said, if you look at the state budget, we saw really big growth in the last year, like almost an extra $1 billion just in 1 year of spending, and that's what Laura Kelly had instituted. And I said that needs to be pared back considerably. As an example, I said Kansas economy is only growing on average 4% a year, right? So that means your state government should be capped at 4% a year. And I said, by doing that, that means your 2026 budget should be around $9.8 billion. And and that's roughly $1 billion less than what we spent last year. Now, that's a North Star. Do I think lawmakers are going to cut $1 billion out of the budget? No. But it kind of gives an idea where things need to be. At least from here on out, every time you pass a budget, one of the questions that needs to be asked is, what is that rate of growth? Is it growing faster or slower than the private sector? If it's growing faster than the private sector, you're creating a problem, right? Not only are you effectively deficit spending, but you're taking more out of the economy than what the economy can produce, right? It's the private sector that creates the wealth, right, for the government to use. And it's not the other way around. So if you want it sustainable, government has to grow slower than the private sector. So that 4% is kind of that benchmark. So as lawmakers are considering, the House had a budget proposal, the Senate's going to have a budget proposal, they're going to have a conference. To their credit, they are reducing spending. I think they need to reduce it more, but they are reducing spending. To give you an idea here, so far, and I think the Senate is debating the budget tonight actually, so far the House proposed lowering fiscal year 2026 spending by about $250 million relative to 25. Before the Senate did their debate tonight, the Senate committee did roughly a similar number, about $240 million reducing relative to 2025 levels. I think it needs to be about $1 billion, right? So we'll see where the compromise gets us, but I'm comparing everything back to 2024. I'm kind of want to erase that double-digit growth that we saw going from 2024 to 25 and say, let's just have a 4% growth. You can still fund services, but now you have that extra revenue to give more tax relief back. Any other thoughts or questions? All right. Well, thank you so much for the time. God bless you all.
Thank you, Michael. We really appreciate you coming, and thank you all for coming. And if you help us put up chairs before you leave, we appreciate it. Thank you.
And what